Welcome everybody to another episode of the Rorschach Ramble, the first Arctic update edition of the Ramble, where we find the most interesting and best people from our specific niche and have a good old chat. I'm your host, Jack Ball. I'm delighted to welcome to the Rorschach Ramble the co-author of Unfrozen, The Fight for the Future of the Arctic, a political geographer, teacher, blogger, space studier, and all-around great person, Dr. Mia Bennett.
Thank you, Jack. It's a very kind introduction.
So Unfrozen, The Fight for the Future of the Arctic. So, say you're on holiday and someone gets chatting to you, you bring up that you're writing this book and they ask, what's it about? How do you describe the book to just a random member of the public?
I'd probably say it is a book that offers an overview of the major geopolitical and environmental forces that are changing the Arctic from how it used to be, let's say, in the past 30 odd years or so, really kind of focusing on how things have changed since the end of the Cold War.
Right, since the end of the Cold War. Okay, so you'd say, is that when things really started to change?
I would say that there were massive geopolitical changes in the Arctic at the end of the Cold War. Effectively, the Soviet Union, then Russia, could start cooperating in a much more effective manner with the other 7 countries with territory north of the Arctic Circle. So that's definitely a big watershed moment in Arctic geopolitics. Okay. So we kind of start the book there, but then we also look at how this, let's say, 30-year interlude of enhanced cooperation is now breaking apart due to Russia's kind of, once again, retreat behind the Iron Curtain, as it were.
I see. Okay. So is it kind of focused around, you have the Arctic Council and these organizations which facilitated this cooperation? That's kind of what brought people together post-Cold War, and now that's breaking up?
Very much so. The Arctic Council, I would say, is more of an outcome of the work of diplomats from Arctic countries, especially Canada and Finland, Indigenous peoples organizations, scientific bodies, civil society. All of these stakeholders really tried. They really tried hard to create a sort of forum. The Arctic Council, as you mentioned, being the end result, to create a setting in which discussions about these shared challenges in the Arctic could take place. So that's really been the preeminent organization fostering these kinds of discussions and work addressing these challenges in a cross-border manner.
Okay. Do you think that there is opportunity for the current, maybe not current state of affairs, it's breaking up, but how we were 10 years ago with this cooperation? Do you think that we might be able to get back to that point, or do you think it's almost a bit too far with the way things in Russia have gone?
I'm deeply skeptical. I would say both Klaus Dodds, my wonderful co-author, also a political geographer, and myself kind of express, I think, a lot of concern that we may not be able to return to a period of cooperation that did indeed reach its height a decade ago. In large part, as you mentioned, because of Russia's isolation and its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Yeah. And also seeing the turn in the U.S. equally to a kind of, we talk about sovereigntism and an interest more in kind of national primacy rather than in international collaboration. So that's also thrown a real spanner in the works for Arctic cooperation. Yeah.
Do you think then that the future of Arctic cooperation is more regional, is more, say, the Nordic Council, the Barents Euro Council, these kind of more select, smaller groups of nations then doing their own little thing and maybe hoping that their goals eventually end up aligning in the Arctic?
I would say so. I think there's definitely still room for Arctic cooperation, just at that much smaller scale you bring up. So yes, I think within, let's say, among the Nordic countries, so Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, Denmark, including Greenland and Faroe Islands, perhaps even between the Nordic countries and, let's say, Canada, we might see increased cooperation. At the same time, you mentioned one small but important organization, the Barents Arctic Council, but even they, which have, their work was premised on bringing together Russia with the Scandinavian countries and Finland. Yes. Their work has really come upon hard times as well, because they just can't do that much with their Russian counterparts anymore. So anything, no matter how big or small, that used to involve Russia and the other Arctic 7 is really under fire at the moment.
Right. Okay. So something that you mentioned in the book is the idea of the Arctic Anthropocene and the global consequences for that. So why would, say, someone in Australia, why would someone far from the Arctic need to care about the human impacts, the Anthropocene of the Arctic?
Yes. So why should someone all the way and the anthropos care about the Arctic? Well, for starters, I think what happens in the Arctic does affect the rest of the world, and what the rest of the world does equally affects the region. That is true in a climactic sense. So, for instance, and this might not necessarily affect Australians so much, but as, let's say, climate change accelerates, you're having the destabilization of various kinds of atmospheric processes that result in, let's say, phenomena like polar vortexes, so sudden blasts of cold air coming down to the mid-latitudes. And that's really kind of worrying for people in temperate cities from, let's say, London to Beijing. But what we also try to point out in the book is that what happens in the Arctic in many other dimensions, so let's say from resource extraction, fossil fuels, minerals, what have you, the green transition, all of this is affecting people around the world as well. And in fact, Australian companies are some of the major potential investors in mining activity in places like Greenland. So we could actually see, in that sense, maybe the Australian mining sector could benefit potentially in terms of mining in the Arctic kind of growing. We try and kind of tease out these more, I think, slightly more hidden commodity chains, networks that have really connected this northern periphery to places you wouldn't even imagine, not only in the present, but going back hundreds of years as well.
Going back hundreds of years?
Yeah, we do try and bring a historical context to the book. So I mentioned kind of geopolitically, the focus is the contemporary moment, but we try to situate a lot of these changes in a deeper history, both ecologically and in terms of resource extraction, movement of peoples, just to give the book a little bit more of a, let's say, well-rounded picture, because I do think a lot of Arctic reporting these days, especially in kind of mainstream media, tends to be highly presentist, even futurist, at the expense of a deeper understanding of the longer forces driving a lot of what we're seeing in the moment.
Yeah. So I think, a lot of historians often say that, history repeats itself. So often what we see in the world, it's we've seen similar situations in the past. So do you think that we've seen similar kinds of situations in human history at some point before? Or I don't know, because the Arctic is such a new frontier, if you like, in a way that maybe we've never seen anything quite like it before.
That's a great question. So on the one hand, I think we have a chapter in the book on looking at, let's say, the past 500 years of resource development in the Arctic. And in that chapter, we really try to kind of push back a bit against the notion that the Arctic is indeed a new frontier, because mining has been going on for so long now.
Cool.
On the other hand, the Arctic is admittedly a new frontier in the sense that I think for the first time in human history, there's so many countries from, as far away as Australia, China, what have you, that are interested and feel like they have a stake in Arctic governance, Arctic development, and so on. So I think that's quite novel. Whereas, Europeans have been interested in northern peripheries for millennia going back to the Greeks. This is really, I think, a new moment in which so many stakeholders are trying to have a say in what happens in a region that at the same time has been a homeland to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples for millennia. So there's, I think, new contestations and challenges as the table kind of for Arctic discussions gets bigger, and as some people maybe don't want that so much.
That's a very good point. I've definitely been seeing in the last few years that this table for Arctic discussions, more and more chairs are seeming to get added to the table. So I think that the countries I've particularly noted have been China's the most obvious one. They for a time they called themselves a near Arctic state. I then believe someone from the government retracted that at some point, but the news is always so conflicting. And then India have been getting involved, South Korea, I think Brazil got they're an observer of the Arctic Council, if I remember right.
Don't think Brazil has, but all the other ones for sure.
Okay. So as all these chairs get added to the table, are they pushing out those indigenous voices?
I don't really see that happening so far. I think that's where the Arctic Council has been a really, wonderful role model for how regional governance can be conducted in a way that involves both the sovereign states with territory in that region and indigenous peoples organizations. So in the Arctic Council, indigenous peoples organizations, there are 6 of them included as permanent participants, and then you have the 8 member states, and consensus between all of these parties needs to be reached on decisions. When the Arctic Council has brought in more observers, so countries without territory, such as China being one of the slightly newer entrants, they received their observer status in 2013, South Korea, etc. These observers all need to agree to respect the rights of both member states and the permanent participants. So we've actually seen kind of exciting innovative partnerships arise. So one that I could mention is South Korea and the Aleut International Association, which represents Aleut or Unagak people in mostly the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They've done work together on mapping indigenous marine use. So I think there's many opportunities actually for observers to bolster indigenous voices and shine a light in different ways on their historical contemporary use of the region. That's a more positive example. I think probably there could be, argument made that expanding the number of stakeholders in Arctic governance does come at the cost of those who have been rights holders for longer. But I'm trying to remain positive for this one. Yeah.
Good. And then, so obviously that's how it affects the indigenous groups. How is this expanding of the table affecting just the regular Arctic states in terms of governance? Are they finding that in some ways it's getting harder to govern the Arctic when suddenly you've got these, let's be real, much larger nations than the Arctic has ever seen suddenly coming into play? Is it getting harder to govern, to make decisions?
I don't think that and this is probably just my personal opinion, I don't think the expansion of observers has made the Arctic harder to govern, because they don't have any say in kind of the agreements or consensus that is reached in a body like the Arctic Council. I think the real worry for the Arctic state territorial or sovereign territorial states is if any one of these observers, let's say, if China and Russia decided to start a separate kind of forum in which to discuss the Arctic, maybe with the United Arab Emirates, which has also just shown a lot of interest in the Arctic lately. If there were a kind of separate forum that excluded Arctic sovereign states or indigenous peoples organizations, that actually could pose a real threat. And I think that's something the Arctic Council has really tried to avoid. And it's why there's still some, work going on with Russia, in a way virtually mostly, because I think they're really trying to avoid a kind of alternate forum potentially arising that would undermine their primacy.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I've found really interesting to try and keep a bit of an eye on, but because it's in Russia, the amount of reliable news coming out of Russia can be difficult. But Russia's aims to develop its Arctic region, so it seems to have this master plan for creating new cities and taking so many people into the Arctic, possibly at the expense of indigenous people. And then Russia's expanding all of its liquid natural gas facilities. I mean, can Russia, get back to a kind of cooperation with, say, the Arctic Council when it is doing this massive redevelopment of its Arctic, which I don't know if that would you say goes against the goals and the ambitions of the Arctic Council?
It's a good question. So Russia does have this desire to really develop the so-called Arctic zone of the Russian Federation, which involves, like you say, developing massive amounts of liquefied natural gas, also oil, and then shipping out these resources via the Northern Sea route as that gets easier and easier to do for more months of the year to places like Asia in particular.
Yeah.
I wouldn't say that Russia's desire to develop its region goes against the goals of the Arctic Council. I mean, it's a complicated one because the Arctic Council pushes for sustainable development, and I would say what Russia's doing is not sustainable. Like you say, it tramples the rights of indigenous peoples in many ways. But, even if, let's say, Russia had not carried out the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, I think it would still be going forward with a lot of this work, and hypothetically, it would still be working with the Arctic Council. So I don't really see them as kind of antagonistic. The bigger worry I find is that maybe in Russia now there's more of an urgency than before to ensure these resources are developed because it needs revenues to bankroll the war.
Yes.
And now without international cooperation with the West, it's going to lack perhaps some of the most, technologies that reach the highest environmental standards as might be used in Norway, which is also trying to push further north as oil development. So that poses a worry and a threat to the Arctic environment that the Arctic Council and Western countries are not really going to be able to assist with now. So that's, I think, definitely going to be a big concern at a pan-Arctic scale.
Yeah. And that's something that you do bring up in the book, isn't it? I think it's the term you use is something like geopolitical competition is accompanying environmental disruption. So are there any other examples of that? So we've got Russia, we've got Norway.
Yeah, I think honestly, a lot of the environmental challenges are concentrated in Russia, which comprises half of the Arctic. One that kind of has its roots in the Cold War is actually the massive amount of radioactive waste that's been just effectively dumped offshore Russia. And there were a lot of cleanup efforts, not necessarily under the umbrella of the Arctic Council, but initiatives that were backed by the European Commission or by Norway and the United Kingdom to try and clean up some of this waste, which poses enormous threats to human well-being, to ecology, to fish stocks. All of this now is on hold. And that's, I think, one article in the BBC called it this kind of Chernobyl at sea. So that's a massive environmental issue that's not really related to climate change, but this legacy, rather, of militarization that I worry is going to kind of rear its head once again now in different ways as we're seeing renewed kind of interest in building up forces in the north. So I think this kind of increased militarization poses a different kind of ecological threat, both kind of historic and coming back to the fore in Russia, but also region-wide, I would argue.
Yeah, the militarization of the Arctic has been really interesting, and as someone who is very much on the environmental side of loving the Arctic, quite upsetting in some ways. When I did my master's degree, in the Finnmark region of Norway, and now that's been home to lots of NATO exercises and things, which is Yeah, I remember it for all the reindeer rather than all the tanks.
Oh, wow. That's fantastic that you're in Denmark. I'm just going to
Yeah,
close the window because I think it's
yeah. Yeah, so actually in terms of the militarization of the Arctic, I think that leads into something that I know you've talked about, which is space, which is the space development of the Arctic. So all these new space facilities like Anduja and others, which I don't remember. But what's that looking like? This new space frontier of the Arctic?
Yeah, it's a really interesting kind of intersection between, let's say, the last frontier, as Alaska calls itself, and the final frontier of space, right? So you have these two areas that have long been on the fringes of the major political and economic centers. And I think they're starting to be woven together by the construction of, as you point out, spaceports in northern Norway, so Andoya, also Kiruna in northern Sweden. There's been a spaceport in Alaska on Kodiak for about, almost 30 years now or so. And then there's several being developed in the UK, which calls itself the Arctic's nearest neighbor. It's a kind of subarctic spaceports. The interest there is to be able to launch satellites into what are called polar orbits. So these are orbits that enable a satellite to kind of circle the globe and cross over the North and South Pole on every orbit, allowing planetary coverage, but also that then makes the polar regions some of the best places to regularly downlink the data from the satellites, as it's called.
Okay.
So you not only have spaceports being built up north, but also these kind of ground stations that are full of antennas that basically communicate with satellites as they pass overhead. So Svalbard actually has the world's largest civilian Earth observation ground station. So kind of infrastructure you wouldn't expect popping up in these very distant regions. So I would say that's kind of another big driver of this connection between the Arctic and space.
Okay. And I get the impression as well that the militarization of the Arctic is part of that driving as well. I don't know if that is that right? Like, is there this idea that the US, for example, has this whole idea of a space part of the military space force? Like, is that part of this move to Arctic space as well?
Absolutely. I would say that if we look back at the slightly longer history of interest in kind of knitting together the Arctic and space, we could go back to the late 19th century when various governments in places like Sweden were interested in, and also the US were interested in kind of studying the ionosphere to look at how radio waves could be propagated across very long distances, largely to support military communication. So there's been a deeper seated interest among militaries in kind of moving north and also upwards at the same time. Another perhaps militarily related kind of driver of the current space race, if you will, is the fact that in a place like Andoya, so I believe it was the Norwegian Air Force had operated a base up in Andoya that operated until sometime in the 2000s. And then, many Western countries decided Russia was no longer a threat. So they started to withdraw a lot of the infrastructure that had been built up during the Cold War to keep an eye on the adversary. And in the kind of absence of military infrastructure, as space has become more commercialized since the 1990s, then I think it was seen as also a kind of infill of these abandoned military sites. A similar kind of process is taking place in Shetland in the United Kingdom, where the old Royal Air Force Base is now becoming a spaceport. So the ironic thing, I suppose, is now a lot of these same countries are thinking, oh, we actually should have kept this infrastructure. Russia is a renewed problem, but why don't we have some perhaps sort of dual use capacity in having both a commercial spaceport that may be, could serve or benefit the military in some form or another. That's not always, those two, let's say, drivers are not always paired, because in some places like Svalbard, the infrastructure, like the ground station, cannot be used for military purposes. That's prohibited by the Svalbard Treaty. But I think outside of that very specific context, we are seeing the kind of dual use benefit to the kind of development of space infrastructure.
Yeah. So the Svalbard Treaty, for listeners, as far as I understand it, essentially that's a treaty signed by something like 150 countries. Have I got that right? Or is that
it's more like 45?
Is it 45? Okay, I'm way off. That allows a lot of cooperation in Svalbard, doesn't it? That people can research and work in Svalbard visa-free, and it says that there has to be no military activity there, and a big part of that is because of Russia's settlements, isn't it? You've got Barentsburg and Pyramiden. But then I know that recently Russia has been complaining a lot that Norway is militarizing Svalbard. Is that true? Or is it just Svalbard have just got a few boats going around and Russia is complaining about that?
Very tricky questions. Gosh. So I would not say that Norway is militarizing Svalbard. Russia is also not militarizing Svalbard. I think what we're instead seeing is a creeping securitization of many issues.
Securitization. That's a good term. I like that.
Yeah. What that means, I think, is issues that previously would have never been seen as a kind of, political hot potato, such as Russia wanting to send a scientific research vessel to do some experiments offshore. Norway, the governor of Svalbard may now perceive that as a threat and not permit such an activity.
Yeah.
They might claim this is not like outright, but they might perceive it rather as a kind of, Russian ship up to no good, carrying out espionage, what have you. And that actually has been done by various Russian fishing boats. So it's not out of the realm of possibility. So yeah, I think that's kind of where things are headed. I think countries are not so much willing to give each other the benefit of the doubt in the Arctic anymore. And they view everything as a kind of, increased securitization, weaponization of this or that. Hybrid warfare is really starting to amplify. So that's kind of where things lie now, is not so much outright conflict or militarization, but a kind of, I think more sinister suspicions of each other.
Okay. You were recently snowmobiling in Svalbard, I believe. I saw on your blog. How did that go?
It was fantastic. Yeah. So that was earlier in May. I had snowmobiled once before on Alaska's North Slope, and I found it absolutely terrifying. I didn't know what I was doing. It was so cold. I thought my nose was going to fall off, but I thought I'd give it a go. I was based in Tromsø for a couple of months this year, thanks to the Fulbright Arctic Initiative and their generous support. So I had a few extra days where I wanted to return to Svalbard for a second time and kind of get a sense of what was happening there politically. But I also thought, well, maybe I'll try my hand at snowmobiling again. So I spent a few days learning how to do that and going around with a great group of other tourists. So also kind of dabbling, which I don't really do in this kind of Arctic tourism, which was interesting to see from an ethnographic perspective as well.
Yeah. I've been snowmobiling in Svalbard. It is, cool. It is. It's my happy place. If I have to picture a happy place, I close my eyes and I just imagine myself on the sea ice snowmobiling.
It's phenomenal. Yeah, if anyone can have the opportunity, I highly recommend it.
Absolutely. And and your blog is Cryopolitics, isn't it?
It is.
I highly recommend anyone checking that out, as well as Unfrozen. Let's see. I've been told to say the name of the book several times, as well as checking out, of course, Unfrozen: The Fight for the Future of the Arctic by Yale University Press. You bring up tourism, actually. So that's a really interesting point. So we mentioned all the politics and militarization, but tourism's a major driving force as well, isn't it, of change in the Arctic?
Mm-hmm.
How do you think that is? How is that progressing? You've in so many ways, economically, environmentally, indigenous rights. How is the future of tourism looking?
Yeah, it's a great question. Tourism is, I would say, a political force in many ways. It's a massive cultural force for change that is sometimes positive, often negative as well. We've seen tourism absolutely explode in places like Iceland. I don't know the numbers offhand, but it's just risen to honestly unsustainable amounts, which I think even the Icelandic government.
In Iceland, it's now probably 3 or 4 times the country's population, isn't it?
By far. I think they must be over millions of people a year coming. I mean, it feels, I think I mentioned book like a 51st state sometimes with the number of Americans in particular that are ambling around the streets of Reykjavik. But so that's brought, a lot of money into particular places in Iceland. So tourism always develops in a very uneven way. Places like Rovaniemi in Lapland and Finland, which is kind of the self-declared Santa Claus capital.
Yeah.
Every winter, tons of families from throughout Europe and also as far away as Japan, Turkey, they all come to kind of, I think, manifest their winter imaginaries. And, now with climate change, Rovaniemi has to ensure there's snow. So they have snow cannons that are at the ready to give a dusting to all the trees. So tourism, it's a big force for economic infrastructure development, what have you. But I think you're starting to see communities push back a bit. They worry, like in Rovaniemi, about how many apartments are being turned into seasonal Airbnbs.
Of course, yeah.
There are sometimes also, I think tourism can elicit, let's say, certain amounts of xenophobia. So there's been a lot of, I think, resistance to, or not resistance, but just maybe more frustration about tourists from places like China, which have different cultural norms, let's say, and don't always, do what the Finn would do in winter, right? So it's been a learning process on both sides. I think, though, at the same time, a lot of these communities came really to rely on huge, amounts of money coming in from Chinese tourists every year, let's say. And after COVID, that really changed. So I don't think Chinese tourists have returned in the same numbers as before. But for many places in the Arctic, it is being made up for by growing numbers still of European and American tourists coming in. Right. So kind of the demographics are changing a bit. But whether Chinese tourists will continue to be a part of the picture in Arctic tourism to the same level as they seem to be on track for before remains to be seen.
Okay. And do you see the growth in tourism in places like the Sapmi region of Norway, of Nunavut, places in Alaska and elsewhere in northern Canada? Can that be a help to indigenous groups and kind of their giving them more economic sustainability in terms of what they can what money they can generate, or is it more of a threat to almost gentrifying their lands?
I think tourism can be a benefit to indigenous communities, but it has to be managed very carefully. The government of Greenland, I think, offers a good example of majority Inuit country that is really trying to propel tourism. Visit Greenland, which is the National Tourism Board, they have this whole kind of be a pioneer style slogan of attracting basically, high income luxury ecotourism. Visitors from places like the US and Europe, which are now connected increasingly by direct flights to the Greenland capital, Nuuk. So in a sense, I think the dream is that a small number of high spending individuals will come and appreciate indigenous culture and leave very little environmental impact on the land.
Okay.
I don't know if that always plays out in reality. Even, let's say, a small luxury cruise vessel coming through has a huge carbon footprint that will affect the Arctic region, the wider world, in the grand scheme of things. these people will sometimes come and maybe they'll buy some indigenous handicrafts, but then there's often this kind of worry that they're also commodifying the culture. They're sometimes taking pictures of, school children in the kindergarten. So there's, I think, a lot of discomfort with turning some of these sites into kind of just spectacles to be consumed. So that's kind of the danger, I think, and the cost of becoming a destination for, let's say, indigenous or ecotourism.
Yeah. I think that's something that has been seen, not just in the Arctic, but around the world, isn't it? You have places like Hawaii where it's almost like a parody of indigenous culture presented to tourists to say, oh, look at the traditional culture, when it's just presented in a fake version for them. So it's interesting how it's going to be preserved amongst all this development.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's another balance to be struck, is that indigenous peoples, they do want to celebrate and sometimes share their cultural traditions with visitors. The other side of that is all of these cultures, like all humans, are always changing and adapting. So they don't want to be looked at as kind of museum relics. So how do we, cherish and celebrate tradition without being turned into some kind of antique? I think that's a question that indigenous communities are wrestling with in different ways, right? Many will come to one conclusion. Others will say, we don't want tourists at all. We want to keep things more for ourselves. So that's, I think, a decision that each community should be able to address and respond to on its own.
Yeah. You mentioned Greenland. Now, Greenland is, oh boy, I can't keep up. I cannot keep up with what's going on.
I can't.
Greenland. Is it the flashpoint that I seem to think it is? That this seems to be the biggest story going on right now, that this could alter so much going on in the Arctic. Like, is this? So, if people haven't kept up to date with the situation, essentially, the USA, and really specifically US President Trump, has a ambition very much to take control of Greenland, and he's gone about this in a number of ways, offering money, vague threats of military action. Let's not say he's gone as far as actually threatening it, but vague threats of that, and sending politicians over. There's recent news about an influence campaign going on. How difficult question. How does the future of Greenland look?
Oh my gosh! Well,
probably impossible question to answer.
We I think, expressly declare we don't try to, divine the future in any sense. We're political geographers, not prognosticators. But it is funny you mentioned that, because I think we finished writing the book probably a week or so before Trump's inauguration, for the first draft of the manuscript, and then, within, I think, a couple weeks of that, we realized, okay, we have to rewrite the chapter on flashpoints. Greenland has become one. But then I think the irony is, sitting here talking to you in September, Greenland still is very much, I think, in the news, but not with that same level of crisis that it was in earlier this year. So should we have turned it into a flashpoint in a book? I can go back and forth on that. But I do think all of that controversy did just, I think, force people to kind of check their assumptions on what is considered normal and permanent in the Arctic. May not actually be the case, given the whims of whoever's in the Oval Office or whoever's in the Kremlin, which may be presented for the next century. So it seems so. But I think things that we took for granted, even the idea that the US and Canada would be best buddies forever, is something we need to question. And I think that's what this idea of flashpoints, that something can become a sudden tripwire, is what we try to shine a bit of a light on.
Yeah. Has the, in terms of how countries and then, of course, the people in those countries are reacting to the Arctic, I'd say that around the 2010s, at least my impression of, at least in the UK and Europe, was that the 2010s was a good time for this idea of save the Arctic. There was a kind of a push for that. With everything that's going on, has the appetite for saving the Arctic, you think that has that waned?
I would agree. It's totally waned. It's quite sad to see. I think a lot of scientists, folks working in NGOs, diplomats who did have more of this, let's say, environmental view of the Arctic, really feel that a lot of that drive that was pushed by organizations like Greenpeace, which should be acknowledged, sometimes against the wishes of Indigenous peoples who sometimes want there to be oil and gas development in their own backyard because they will see jobs and revenues flow in. That whole drive, though, at a larger scale in the Arctic, I think it's taking a back seat because even governments that generally have been a lot greener, like Norway, are now saying we need to drill for oil and gas for the next 100 years. We need to mine our seabed offshore for minerals to power the green transition. Even the green transition itself, we're seeing wind turbines built across Sapmi, across the Sami homelands, without really fair and free consultation. So I think this whole idea of saving the Arctic, as problematic as it is and was, I think is really losing a lot of steam, I would say.
Yeah, that's always a shame, isn't it? I mean, I'm just a polar bear nut who just wants to see happy polar. I've got a tattoo of a polar bear. I've got a stuffed polar bear.
Oh my goodness.
Just want polar bears to be happy. I mean,
well, that's good because I'm thinking if I write a second book, I kind of want to write a sort of environmental and history and human history, as it were, of polar bears. So maybe that'll be my next project.
I'm absolutely keeping an eye out for that.
We'll see.
Great. You mentioned the green transition. That's something that's been really an interesting and difficult idea to come to terms with, because there is this idea that yes, we do need this renewable energy, and you mentioned the wind turbines being built on indigenous lands. Then you've also got mining. Mining that is such a huge driver of the green transition, but then you also have, of course, it's mining. It's environmentally destructive. I mean, how does the Arctic, be this source of material for a green transition while still being the healthy Arctic? Is that really possible to fit the resource needs of, I mean, the world in terms of Greenland? The Greenland could be powering much of the world, but is that going to come at the cost of this pristine Arctic environment?
I would maybe push back against the idea of the Arctic environment being pristine.
Oh, of course. Yeah, humans have been there too long for it to be pristine.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've had human, migration, settlement, use of the Arctic for tens of thousands of years. Yeah. Mining, we could say, has gone on for maybe 500 years. Whaling, there's been all sorts of extractive activities that have taken an immense toll on Arctic ecology and Arctic indigenous peoples. I would say whaling actually was just a huge disaster. And I don't know the numbers, but just the number of cetaceans that were removed from Arctic waters is just devastating.
Yeah, in some cases it was, something maybe like 90% of the population, wasn't it? It was really
that's right. Yeah, horrible. Just eviscerated. So, and that did power a lot of European lamps, let's say, and provide bones for their corsets. And the same material had been used by indigenous peoples, but in a much smaller scale, at a much more sustainable one, right? To provide kind of the structures of sod houses, other sorts of materials, things like that. So, when we look in the present moment of whether the Arctic can serve as a place for wind and hydropower generation and providing rare earth minerals in a way that is sustainable, I think it could be done. I don't think that really anyone living in the Arctic wants to see it turned into a kind of global national park where there's no development at all.
Yeah.
I think the question is, how can we balance, or how can the people of Greenland, for example, balance having a rare earth mine, which may there involve extracting uranium as well, and do that in a way that provides local jobs and training, keeps most of the revenues in Greenland, and is done safely in a way that also can have some, let's say, more widespread benefits for the global economy. I think that requires a huge amount of consultation that would take years of debate. And I think there's a lot of impatience in the world today. So I'm not confident that a lot of these extractive projects can be done in a careful manner. But I do think hypothetically some of them could be.
Okay. Yeah, because I know Canada has very recently pushed forward, a bill all about rapidly advancing these Prime Minister, right? Prime Minister Carney, I think he's called it nation building projects. So that will be interesting to see how that. He has gone on the record and said that he will still consult with Indigenous groups, but it'll be interesting.
That is the big worry. I mean, I haven't followed that development in Canada, but I think something similar has happened in, I believe it's Sweden or Norway. You'd have to check for me, but I think the idea is that Indigenous people, the Sami there, also people like Kven, Forest Finns, or some other Indigenous peoples in the northern Nordic countries, but they're meant to be consulted under national law in all of these cases, except exceptions can be made in the case of national security or military, right? So this is just increasingly, I think, going to give national governments kind of the ability to rubber stamp projects that normally in a less geopolitically tense environment maybe would be given more due process. So I think that's the big worry today, is that things are just going to get railroaded in, not because people aren't aware of Indigenous rights, but they're just going to fall victim to the supposed threat of Russia, honestly.
Yeah. I think it's going to be interesting to see how much suddenly becomes necessary to national security, as what they consider national security.
Exactly.
Yeah. Great. So what message then, people listening, what message can people take away about how things are moving in the Arctic?
A very dark message.
Okay.
It is not.
Yeah, if people listening to this, if they listen, so I write the Arctic Update podcast, it's 90% bad news.
Yeah, I consider myself a sometimes cheerful person, but I don't have a lot of good tidings to bring with Klaus about the Arctic, I'm afraid. I think maybe, yes, the book paints a rather grim picture of geopolitical or the potential for, let's say, international cooperation, for even scientific cooperation at a pan-Arctic scale. Climate change is a one-way street to kind of doom and gloom. I think I am seeing growing appetite in international forums for at least discussing geoengineering and those kinds of interventions now. Some people think, maybe this could be some sort of Deus ex machina that gets us out of this rapidly warming and much wetter world. And I don't have a very strong opinion on it at the moment, except that I am open to the possibility that maybe geoengineering could provide a different climatic ending to what's happening in the Arctic.
Yeah,
I think
geoengineering. I'm quite aware of it, but for people listening, what are some examples of the kind of geoengineering projects that have been going on?
So, there haven't been any huge
it's testing right now, isn't it? Rather than
looking at, let's say, for instance, variations of solar radiation modification, which could involve one example is marine cloud brightening, where you inject some sort of particles into the atmosphere, if I understand it correctly, to change the clouds to make them brighter, more reflective, so that basically they bounce more sunlight back into space so that it doesn't warm the atmosphere as much. That's one possible intervention that I think a number of prominent climate scientists have at least gotten behind more testing or more experimenting, if not quite using it yet. The other one that is much more controversial involves some sort of modification to the ice, whether this, that involves kind of putting glass beads on Arctic sea ice to enhance what's called its albedo or its reflectivity. And then that, in theory, would make the ice grow thicker and stronger again. So those are kind of the two main categories being proposed in the Arctic, which obviously have all sorts of unforeseen, not only ecological, but also geopolitical consequences, because any intervention in the climate is inherently transboundary. So I don't think, one country might be happy with the modification that they're going to propose to carry out. That could negatively affect another. So how to work all of this out it's a huge black box.
Yeah, and that brings up actually, I think, something that you cover in the book, which is the Arctic as a global commons. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that's a really interesting idea of in some way having the Arctic being this area for cooperation and sharing, but is that what would it take to be able to set up some kind of Arctic global commons? I mean, I think so much of the land is so heavily divided now. You've got bits of the Arctic Ocean in the center that could maybe be assigned as commons, but is that in any way you think possible?
Well, I would say that about, I forget the numbers now, but so the central Arctic Ocean, the area of the Arctic Ocean that is in the center, kind of around the North Pole, that is already the global commons. Let's say it's technically or legally high seas. Yeah. So under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, as the kind of main international treaty governing the seas is called, any country could sail through there or go fishing or do any sort of number of other activities. The thing is, though, the high seas have basically been inaccessible to most ships except for Russian nuclear icebreakers. Even to this day, things are gradually changing, and I think a lot of scientists are concerned we may see the first ice-free Arctic oceans for only about 1 month a year, but that could be a possibility in summer, sometime in the next decade. So I think that's actually where you might see pressure on the fact that the Central Arctic Ocean has been, let's say, respected as a global commons because just no one can get up there. Once that is under, once that situation changes, I think there's a possibility. I don't think any, so the various countries which have potential claims to the waters in that area and the continental shelves, so that would be Russia, Canada, and Denmark, they're all proceeding in a very diplomatic way to file their claims based on geological evidence to the UN body that deals with that. So I don't think there's going to be a sudden breakdown of that, hopefully, but you may start to see increased usage, at least, of this commons that could jeopardize its status as very much commons going forward.
Yeah. I've been keeping a bit of track on that geological evidence to expand territory, and I think that could be another interesting flashpoint. I think in one country, I think it's Russia is going for, I can't remember the name of there's a kind of a rift going from Siberia towards Greenland, isn't there?
The Lomonosov Ridge.
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. And I think that if I remember right, I think that their claim essentially goes back to saying that, well, in geological times past, this was a part of or close to Russia. So now, even though now it's moved, it's still technically a geological part of Russia. And I think that could then open up, as you say, you've got all these other nations that then could make claims themselves. So I think could see a lot of changes in Arctic territory. You don't think that's the case?
I not so sure of that. I think so. Actually, Russia was the first Arctic state to submit its claim to the UN Commission on the limits of the continental shelf, and they were given a recommendation to revise their claim, which they redid, and now they've mostly actually been given positive recommendations, as it's called by this international body. So I don't think their claim is anything unbased. Basically, the issue is that while that body gives recommendations, the actual delimitation work needs to be done between countries. Like this, the delimitation of maritime boundaries won't happen arbitrarily by an outside body. So Russia would need to settle that boundary with Canada and Denmark. So I think that will be more difficult to do in a way, given in the present moment at least. But no recommendation is forthcoming for Canada or Denmark for probably years, maybe into the 2030s. So all of this will be, if we have the status quo, which is unclear, I think things will take a long time to settle. But I don't see other countries coming in to suddenly make claims.
All right.
The one wild card I might mention is actually the US, which is not a signatory to UNCLOS. And then under the Biden administration at the end of 2023, issued kind of just unilaterally its, much extended limits to its extended continental shelf.
Yeah, a big change.
It just suddenly claimed all of this maritime space. And I was quite surprised. I still have to kind of think through that. And there's some issues, for instance, how do Canada and the US delimit their boundary in the Beaufort Sea? And those two countries are working together to try and do that, or at least they were. They set up a commission under the Biden administration. But yeah, I'm not really so worried about a sudden kind of territorial grab or scramble, let's say.
Okay.
But I think there's many other points of conflict that could arise that are a little bit less conventional, let's say.
Okay. What would those unconventional points of conflict be?
I think one we're starting to see more and more of is the sabotage of submarine cables.
Absolutely, yeah.
These sorts of conflicts, I think, will play out rather than, let's say, Canada and Denmark fighting over Hans Island, right? They did finally settle that, but I don't see that as an immediate worry, but it is really, I think, an issue when, submarine cables are cut, and this affects civilians as well, with cables carrying 95% of the world's communications. This sort of issue is also very difficult to stop and to monitor. So I think that's something we may see more of, especially as also in the book we discuss how there's more and more plans for building submarine cables through the Arctic because it offers a shortcut for communications between Asia, Europe, and North America. So as there's more infrastructure built in the Arctic, the region could also become more of a target for this sort of hybrid warfare, as it's called, which inevitably, can impact civilian populations.
Okay. Yeah. So let's say then, people listening to the episode that hopefully they've taken away some things, learned some things, but what are three important facts about the Arctic that would be good for people to know, to come away from?
Oh my gosh, that's funny you mentioned that because I just read a review of our book in the Literary Review, which is a UK literary journal, and they said, there's an array of facts that could have benefited from more authorial comment. And I thought, I do have a propensity for just, I think, like dumping random facts on people, like uninitiated. Maybe the book could have benefited from some more editing there. But so let me try and think off the top of my head as 3 facts that are important, because I do have a propensity for enjoying trivia, which is probably unhelpful here. Let's see.
Yeah, that's my catnip, but maybe not everyone's.
Let's see. Well, I think maybe I'll try and go for unexpected facts. Maybe. One that really did strike me, and this was something I learned from an interview with Dirk Knotz, who's a professor of oceanography, glaciology in Hamburg, Germany, and he mentioned that Arctic sea ice is only 25% of its previous volume, which really struck me because I think of Arctic sea ice as I don't know. I think I almost had a two-dimensional kind of sense of it as just getting like shrinking, in the map of the world. But the fact that it's also, so it basically lost half of its extent, but also half of its depth. And that combined creates this 25% or reduction to 25% of its former size. And that's just such an immense loss of a whole landscape, we could call it, because Arctic sea ice has been this kind of platform for indigenous people, coastal indigenous people who go hunting, fishing, transportation, for walruses to just take a nap or polar bears to hang out. This landscape has just been lost. So that's one fact that I find really shocking. And
when's that going back to? You said like it's been 25% compared to when?
I should know that, but I think since records started, I forget if it's since continuous satellite records started in the 70s.
Satellite was what, 1979 was when they started?
More or less, yeah. So I think, that amount of change has been just the blink of an eye geologically, right?
Wow, so 75% in just, 50 odd years, yeah.
It's, a really terrible fact, maybe. So that might be one. Second fact, let's see. The Arctic is home to 4 million people. I believe 500,000 are indigenous. And I think that just that demographic picture alone gets forgotten in a lot of reporting on the Arctic. I've had, friends I've known my whole life, and I tell them, I went to a Thai restaurant in Greenland when I was there. And they say, there's people in Greenland, right? Yeah, there are people. There are also Thai people, lots of great Thai restaurants. So I think understanding that the Arctic is an inhabited place, unlike Antarctica. Antarctica has scientific people and assistance, but the Arctic has been a homeland for so many people for millennia, and I think that should not be forgotten or discounted. A third fact, let's see. I'm kind of trying to think of something off the top of my head. I don't know. I need like a hint or something. What kind of category would you look for?
Oh, okay. So we've done, we've got culture, kind of environment, I suppose, with the sea ice. Let's say history. You got something maybe historical.
Historical. Okay, let me think for a second. So I'm being kind of slow. Historical fact. Okay, maybe. I think an interesting fact. I'm going to try and get the numbers right. Inuit people who crossed into North America, or the ancestors crossed from North America from Siberia. So they made it all the way from Alaska to Greenland, I think in the span of 300 odd years or so, which is an incredible expansion just powered by basically kayaks, umiaks, which are larger types of kayaks, and probably walking up points. Yeah. And in that same time frame, Europeans were still struggling to find their way through the Northwest Passage. I'm not simultaneously, but it would take them much longer to find that passage. So I think that is a testament to Inuit mobility, resourcefulness, creativity, adaptability, just to see how they covered one of the most inhospitable regions in such a quick amount of time and made it all the way to southern Greenland from Alaska.
Wow, incredible. And I mean, that's not just in terms of distance, but they're operating on pure determination at that point. That's just the beauty of humans, of saying what's in the next cave. We've always done that. And that's one thing I've always found, when people talk about space and they say, why should we care about space? And I always say, well, it's what we do. We say what's in the next cave, and the next cave might just be space. Maybe it's the deep sea, maybe it's space, but we've just got to find what's in that next cave.
I completely agree. And I think that's almost a universal impulse, right? It's not only Europeans who have, carried out this age of exploration, but people of every human race and ethnicity, and indigenous or non-indigenous. I think there's that drive to discover what lays over the horizon. And that's really a kind of beautiful story that has often, yes, ended disastrously for other people, but also over time, collectively, humanity has discovered more and more places. And I think that's been just a story of curiosity. And that's something that's also driven me, I think, to learn more about the Arctic from the people who live there. So I've been really grateful for all the encounters and conversations I've had with people in my travels across their lands.
Beautiful, beautiful. And yeah, over your time of studying the region, how has your thoughts and ideas about the Arctic changed over time?
How have they changed over time? I first started really studying the Arctic in 2008. So getting on 20 years ago now. And that was when I was an intern at the USMC in Oslo. And that year was when the US Geological Survey released its so-called circumpolar assessment on, or circumarctic assessment on oil and gas resources. So at that time, there was a sense that the Arctic was going to undergo this scramble for territory and resources. And I, being an undergraduate, thought, oh, this is like quite worrisome, but also kind of fascinating. And now I think I've just come to realize that things are ever more complex. It's not just a matter of, shifting borders even, or who gets what oil field, but the Arctic is an incredibly rich mosaic of shifting populations, of shifting animal species. And rather than being a place that's been frozen forever, it's actually a story of constant change and adaptation. And even though I think I have a lot of sadness at the current state of affairs, there's also a sense in me that people and animals and environments do have a large amount of resilience and in surprising ways. So how that will all play out, even in this moment of extreme volatility, is something that, I think I'm more just, let's say, receptive to trying to remain a little bit positive instead of just seeing this horrible kind of race for resources unfold. So trying to find the positive stories there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, with the warming and the greening of the Arctic, you can maybe say, well, at least there's going to be all these new species and animal interactions and things. It isn't like the Arctic is. I mean, the Arctic is technically disappearing, if you like, under the current definition of what we might call the Arctic, but then it's just changing, and you can see change as something beautiful, can't you? If you suppose it depends on how you look at things, but
it does depend, right? And I always realize I'm saying a lot of this from a position of immense privilege, basically as an academic, ensconced and not living in the Arctic, basically, in being in the southern city. So I think there's going to be a huge amount of loss from what's happening geopolitically, ecologically in the region, but there will be new encounters as well, and new stories of human resilience will emerge. And I think that's one thing I have learned in my conversations with people there, is that they don't want to be painted as victims all the time. Like, it is important to acknowledge the loss that is happening, but also to try and uncover stories of, okay, let's say Inuit people have been in the Arctic for hundreds, if not thousands of years. They'll probably still be there. It will just, the way they live will take a different form. And understanding that this is a story of human adaptation is, I think, one to recognize as well.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, let's the beauty of human adaptation. Let's try and
crossed, right? Even in the most adverse of circumstances. So.
Yeah. Great. So yeah, where can people, find your work and see more of what you write?
Great. So Klaus Dodds and I, we have this book that comes out at the end of September in the UK. It's available from most major booksellers, hopefully. So Waterstones, for instance, but also on Amazon UK. And wherever
I've seen it available to pre-order on. I've seen it on hive.co.uk and bookshop.co.uk. So it's available to pre-order right now. I think release date September 23rd.
Okay, that sounds right. And then it comes out in the US about a month later. So that's all very exciting and nerve-wracking at the same time.
Yeah.
And then you can find my blog posts, as you mentioned, on cryopolitics.com. And if you're interested in my academic work, it's usually behind a paywall, but I'm happy to share any articles on more obscure topics. If you want to just email me directly, I'm always happy to do that and chat with people about it.
Perfect. Great. Yeah, I did see, I was reading your article on the dark Arctic yesterday, which was freely available to read completely. So I was very happy about that.
Yeah. Thank you for reading that.
Great. And what's next?
What's next? Well, I've just started a fellowship supported by the British Academy at the University College London Centre for Outer Space Studies. So I'm actually working more on space stuff at the moment. So I'll be looking at the geopolitics of Starlink, which is Elon Musk's internet constellation. But after this 6-month fellowship, I'm kind of daydreaming about my next book project, which, as I mentioned, maybe we'll look at polar bears kind of in this wider human environmental history, because I haven't found too many titles on that. And I'm really inspired by books like Mark Kurlansky's Cod, or these other ones that kind of tell a bigger picture about one specific item. So maybe I'll pursue that path. And I did see my first polar bear this year. I haven't gotten a tattoo like you.
See.
It's just such a revelatory moment, right?
I didn't see any polar bears. I spent a month in Svalbard, didn't see any polar bears.
It's frustrating.
Tragic. Yeah. And other people I was there with did. They did.
My gosh.
I didn't. They saw walruses, they saw polar bears, they saw Arctic foxes. I missed it all. Absolutely tragic. But
I won't rub it in by telling you how many days I had to spend to see a polar bear, which was not many. But I really hope you get to see one, and a walrus and a fox one day. Because this is part of the magic of the Arctic as well. It's just these other amazing animals that have made a life and carved out a little niche for themselves. So it'd be fun to tell a story of the Arctic on that scale, I think. So maybe writing another book. I've really enjoyed this process. It's had its ups and downs, but in the end, I found it really rewarding, and hopefully people will enjoy Klaus and my work.
All right, beautiful. Yep. So that is Unfrozen, The Fight for the Future of the Arctic by Mia Bennett and Klaus Dodds, available from September 23rd. And I've had a really great time. Thank you so much.
So, Liza, thanks for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Take care.
Cheers. You too.